First talk is by Jordan Kendall on secondary craters at the Apollo 17 landing site, new approaches from modeling and observations.
Thank you, Ryan. For those who don't know me, I am Jordan Kendall. I'm a postdoc at NASA Goddard working with Noah Petro. And today I'll be talking a little bit about the formation of secondary craters at the Taurus Littrow Valley where the Apollo 17 mission landed. What's surprising is there's a recent study by Schmidt et al. From last year that found that the landslides at the base of the South Massif, and which were originally thought to be caused by ejecta landing in the valley, may have actually also been two independent events, one of which could have been a tectonic shaking, as they see elsewhere in the valley with the Lee-Lincoln Scarp. This makes sense. There's a fault nearby. The other possibility is that the ejecta that created these secondary craters also littered the area and caused this landslide to occur. And I think this is an important thing because it tells us that some of the assumptions that we might be making about the age and timing of these events is not entirely clear. And we want to try to reapproach these secondary craters from a perspective of observations and modeling and see if we can kind of help elucidate some of the timing and what happened here. So to go back, in 1977, Lucida showed, here on the right, that you can see the South Massif and North Massif. It's a little hard to see with the projector, but they outline areas in which they thought they were seeing secondary craters. And we'll get to sort of, on the next few slides, how you kind of can determine that they're secondaries. But the assumption was that these secondaries were being created by Tycho crater. And on the bottom left, you can see a picture of the near side, and at the bottom is Tycho crater with all of its lovely rays coming out of it. And when you have a primary crater such as Tycho, you eject a large amount of material, you create these crater rays, and some of the material that is ejected clumps together into these clusters of secondaries, these secondary craters, or secondaries as you can refer to them. And when we're trying to look at the valley, or anywhere on the moon really, it's important to be able to distinguish between these primaries and secondaries. Because it helps you figure out the provenance of samples from Apollo, crater counting ages, and identifying where these secondaries originate from. One of the things that you can do is look at the depth-diameter ratio. Since secondaries are impacts at much lower speeds, between 1 to 2 kilometers per second, they don't excavate as much material, they don't dig as deeply. The other thing is if you have a terrain that has a clustering of craters that are concurrently or simultaneously impacting into each other or into the surface, you see features such as herringbone structures or these V-shaped ridges on the bottom left that come about because the craters are forming at the same time and their ejecta and opening is interacting. One of the other clues we can use is a recent study done by Vasilevsky in 2018 that looked at the secondary craters from Tycho elsewhere on the moon, specifically in Mare Nectaris. And what they did was they looked at the rim and surrounding area of each of a couple secondary craters and put together a spatial density of boulders at these crater rims. And this gives us kind of a sense of what a secondary from Tycho might look like when we go back to Apollo 17 area. So going back to this point that these landslides were independent events, I think it gives us this great opportunity to reevaluate what's happening in the valley. And there's a bunch of recent research that sort of helps motivate this. And the question is for us is, can we use observations and modeling to help unravel if these craters are primary or secondary? And specifically, if it is secondary craters that come from Tycho, what would they look like? And what can we learn from Tycho to help inform this? So we can use LRO for the observations. We have this great suite of data. And on the left is the Lucida image I showed earlier. On the right is the DTM from LROC-NAC with the shaded region shown. And what we decided to focus on is the central cluster over here, and specifically just start with a few craters and try to see if we can distinguish between secondaries and primaries, and what does that tell us. And again, it can be difficult to distinguish the two, but we think we have a decent grasp on it. And one thing that we can utilize is, again, this correlation between the boulder abundance and the age to help discern if it's a primary or secondary. So if we zoom in into that central cluster, we decided to look at a couple craters that were similar in size. In the middle of it, you have Steno and Emery. And up to the left, you have Camelot, which is still part of this overall cluster, but it's sort of off to the side. And we chose Camelot because it has some peculiarities about it. It has two different ages that seem to be in conflict. And most evidence points to it being a primary, whereas the others seem to be secondary. So in order to sort of look at that and determine, we start, if this is the case, we start with just simple depth diameter ratios using a profile from LRARC. And what you see is that Camelot has a ratio of 0.11, Steno and Emery have 0.14 and 0.12 respectively. And they all seem to be similar. And if we think about a primary crater, these Class B type primary craters, what you would expect is a ratio of 0.19. So this means that these are either secondaries or they're highly degraded, okay? So in order to go further with that, and here on the bottom left, I'm showing a zoom in of Camelot. We can say, okay, Steno and Emery, if we look at the boulders, are there any differences between them? Well, Steno and Emery have many boulders compared to Camelot. And what this implies is that Steno and Emery are not highly degraded. They're distinctive from Camelot. So that's either something to do with the age, or it could alternatively be that there's some difference in the target properties at the Apollo 17 site. That seems unlikely, but it could, if that's the case, then it might be inhibiting boulder production and something to consider. And with our modeling, we could actually answer that. But the degradation alone doesn't seem to explain these smaller depth to diameter ratios. So it seems that, of course, that Steno and Emery are secondary in origin, possibly from Tycho. Whereas the correlation, if we consider the boulders at Camelot, which are much fewer, it seems to have a relatively older age. And this suggests that Camelot is, of course, older than Tycho and all these secondary craters. And that's consistent with the result that Schmidt et al. Found last year using a topographic diffusion approach of 500 million years. And what's interesting, again, is this 100 million year exposure age that they found at Camelot. The samples that they brought back were 100 million years, not 500 million years. So trying to understand why that might be the case is important and gives us some understanding, would give us some understanding of the history of these events at Apollo 17. And we think our numerical model has a possible solution here. So if you don't know, I do impact modeling. And what I do is I have a model that shows secondary cratering, so it was perfect to apply to this case. I use ISO 3D, which is a hypervelocity shock physics hydrocode. What it allows you to do is vary the impactor size, shape, velocity, target properties, if you want to have a weaker or stronger surface, and test things like the surface in the valley. And more importantly, since it's in 3D, we can observe different angles and do oblique impacts and see how that affects the ejecta coming out of these secondaries. And we can track all the material as well. And using this, some of the preliminary results is that we found of similar sized craters, a similar depth diameter ratio for Steno of around 0.14. Which matches well with some of these secondaries we're seeing in the central cluster. And that's using, a impactor at about 2 kilometers per second. And what's more interesting, though, is with these test cases that we did of impacts closer together, what you see is imprinting of the ejecta of one crater onto the other. You see that elsewhere with dumbbell-shaped craters. But it gives us the idea that maybe, we have several craters near Camelot, and maybe it's the secondary craters are ejecting material that is landing on Camelot. And the question is, if we can go forward with this work, can we actually show that in great detail? And that's a difficult problem because it requires a large amount of numerical accuracy and computational power. So the question then becomes, okay, if the central cluster is from Tycho, or some other primary, such as Proclus or whatever it may be, and Camelot is a pre-existing older primary crater, then would we see some overprinting of secondary ejecta on Camelot's rim or floor? And could that explain these younger 100 million year boulders that they were able to sample? And we think that our modeling does suggest this is a strong possibility. So going forward, we think we can try to address these questions, along with the hypothesis that the valley floor, if it's made of weaker material in various areas, might explain this boulder retention problem. And if we're going to model this in further detail, we really need to nail down what is the actual primary source, the primary crater. If it's Tycho, then what we need to know from it is what kind of angles and velocities is it ejecting this material that actually reaches the Taurus-Littrow Valley. And that's a hard problem because we don't know very much about the size-velocity relationship for ejecta. With 3D codes, I've been able to, before, discern where the ejecta goes and what amounts and at what speeds and what angles. And so we're confident that we can do the same with Tycho, but in order to do so, you need to be able to resolve the small blocks that create these secondaries. So you need to have very fine resolutions. So in conclusion, the recent work by Schmidt et al. Along the South Massif gives us a unique opportunity to reevaluate the secondaries in the Taurus-Littrow Valley and think more about this assumption that Tycho crater is the cause of all these events. What we find is that the age of Camelot does appear to be older than the Tycho event, as well as the landslides on the slope of the South Massif. And we put forward that maybe a possible alternative explanation is that there's just some difference in the properties of the material there that is causing these younger boulders to form as the crater deteriorates or erodes away. And our preliminary modeling results seem promising. We've been able to match some of the depth diameter ratios and show some that the ejecta coming out of these secondaries could reach Camelot crater. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, so we have time for a couple questions. I actually have one.
Yes, right.
I find the boulder stuff kind of interesting. When you're looking at the boulder populations, are they boulders just within the crater or outside the crater?
Yes. So the work that was done by Basilevsky was focusing on the rim and exterior. Yep. So when we were looking at it for this, it was specifically trying to kind of reproduce that. But if you're looking at the 100 million year ages of Camelot, for example, I believe it's kind of believed to be all throughout in a way.
Okay, yeah. I only asked because, and this isn't published yet, but I have an undergrad who's doing counts of the area, and actually when you look at this cluster, you cannot distinguish which crater the boulders came from because there's so many. So I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, so that's like sort of a longer term problem would be to try to rebuild what happened there and see where material was exchanged, right?
Okay, well, we should talk.
Yes, we should.
All right. Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you.